So in this episode, we are continuing off. We've got our history states where we can capture everything on screen and reload it to get the exact point that we were at a different point in time. And now we're going to go ahead and make a history manager and a history traversal script where we can go through and navigate through and forward all of the history states that we have cached into the system. So let's start by making a new script called a history manager. In addition to the history manager, we're also going to have another script that controls the navigation. So we'll make another script called history navigation. So we have a script for our manager and our navigation. Now let's go ahead and add a new manager, create empty, and call this history manager. The history manager is going to have both of these scripts attached to it. And now let's go ahead and open them both up. I'm going to control click them and hit enter. And now I've got both the navigation and the manager up. So the history manager is going to have an instance because we'll have several things reference it. And we'll have one of them will be our history navigation. So it'll run and it'll just access the history list through the manager. So let's do a public static history manager instance, publicly retrievable, privately assignable, and define that in awake. So void awake instance equals this. So now let's go ahead and get the history traversal. So private history navigation, and we'll call this navigation, which will be nothing, but in awake, we'll say that navigation equals get component history navigation since they are tied to each other. So maybe we'll also require a component for this thing. So require component type of, and this will be history navigation. Okay, so we'll just require that to be paired together. Now this manager is going to save all of the history states that the dialog system tells it to cache. So we'll go ahead and say public list, so our navigation can access it, history state. We're saving all the states and we'll just call this our history. That'll be a new list of history states. So that's that. And let's go ahead and say what happens when we try to log a history state. So we don't need an update function here, but we do want a public void called log current state. And what log current state is going to do is it's going to grab the history state. So history state equals history state dot capture, and then history dot add state. So we capture it and we add it to our history. And how about for loading a state? Public void load state, and we'll just take a history state as a parameter. And inside this function, we'll just call state.load. Simple as that. Now, as for actually recording these things, we want to make sure that all history states are added to this list whenever the player clicks, but not whenever they click. So we only want to add it when new text pops up on the screen and clears out the old text. So this is not going to count for appended text. The reason being is appended text is still part of the same line that's being generated, whereas clear segmented text is essentially treated as a new line. And for every new line, we want every new line and the state of the visual novel at that point to be recorded. So we're going to ignore anything that's appended, and we're just going to trigger this every time it's cleared. So we need a little event for that. And we'll define that inside of our dialog system. So I'll just go ahead and say dialog system, control click and navigate to it, and we're going to create another system event. So like we have for on user prompt next, where we can define what happens when we click on the screen. You know, we got on system prompt and on user prompt, but they both call the same event. So that's when the user clicks, but not when the screen is cleared. So let's go ahead and duplicate that dialog system event, and we'll just call this on clear. So whenever text is cleared from the screen, this is going to be executed. And we'll come down to on user prompt, on system prompt, and I'm just going to say public void on system prompt clear. And we'll call on clear dot invoke. So anything that is subscribed to this will be executed. Now, when does this get called, though? For that, we need to go to our conversation manager. Our conversation manager will run it as soon as we finish the line that we're working on. So we get our line here, and then we try to advance to the next conversation, or the next line in the conversation. We could put it here, but the problem with that is this is called on every line. And that could be a command line where the user doesn't click, where nothing new has come on screen. These things have just run. So only when the user clicks, which is right in here, where we are waiting for user input, this is where we would go ahead and clear it. So let's go ahead and say dialog system dot on clear. Actually, we'll say dialog system dot on system prompt clear. So that's going to happen, and we'll go ahead and run it there. But we need to add it in another location too, because this is at the end of a complete line, which could have multiple segments. Some of those segments could be clearing the screen, and we need to add the history at each one of those parts too. So we need to come down to when we go and handle the segments. So as we wait for a segment signal to be triggered, this is where we also want to apply it here. So we just want to change this up slightly. So on C, we're going to call this, we need to make sure we break, and we also want to wait for user input here. After we've gotten user input, only if we're clearing the screen, then we'll call on system prompt clear. So we'll do the same thing for WC and WA as well. It's a little unfortunate, but you know, it is what it is. We are now separating these things into separate logic. So we'll wait on that. Waiting on auto timer will be false, and then we'll call the clear as well. So we'll automatically generate history states on these different segments as well, only for the ones that clear the screen. So for our history manager, when we start, let's go ahead and say dialog system.instance.onClear plus equals something. We need to log the current state, right? So we'll log the current state. Now the cool thing is, with all of these things being serializable, if we have this public history state, we should be able to see that in the inspector in Unity, and we should be able to watch it grow. Which we do. Inside of history, or the history manager, we have a history list. So let's start Unity and watch it build this thing. We should get a bunch of different history states every time the screen clears. So here we are, Sky rumbled, we just cleared it and we got a history state generated, which said Sky rumbled as the storm approached. There we go. And looks like we're getting them generated. Each time, it did not happen for the wait and append, but it does happen for the clear. And let's go ahead and just skip through a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
There we are. So we generated a bunch of history states for all of this. So it looks like our list is working. So now we need to handle traversal and navigating through backwards and forwards through this history list. So let's go back to our history navigation script. And I'm just going to remove start and update. But what I do want is I want two functions called go forward and go back. So I'll have a public void called go forward and another one, public void called go back. And history manager, I'm also going to make some links to those. So public void go forward is going to equal our navigation.go forward. And I'll do one for go back as well. Go back will equal navigation go back. With these links in place, let's go back to a script where we have our player input. This was the player input manager. If we control click and go inside of here, we've got several actions that can be assigned. as of right now, we've only got one action that is configured within our input actions, and that is next for when we click on the screen. So let's hop to Unity real quick and configure something to go back and forward through history. If we go over to our player input manager and just double click our input action asset, we can see we have that next trigger here. So let's just add another one. Let's make this one history back. And let's make another one history forward. So for going back, I'm going to use the left arrow key. And for going forward, I'm going to use the right arrow key. I'll also tie this into the next trigger, but I'm going to make a dedicated one here as well. So let's go ahead and save that and close it out and go back to our input manager. Now for us to link these up, we need two new functions just like on next, which take in the input action callback context. I'm going to paste that twice and just call this on history back and on history forward. And all this is going to do is we'll take out dialog system, but we'll replace that with history manager instance go forward, or go back for this one. And for go forward, we'll say, you guessed it, history instance go forward. Now we'll link these up. We'll duplicate this line, say input actions history back will be on history back, and history forward, like it, oh good, man, my spelling, on history forward. What happened to my forward? On. Wow, yes, my spelling is severely abused today. So on history forward. And now we've linked these up. So for our history manager, that goes ahead and we'll reference the navigation go forward, and we can define what these do. So these functions should make us go back and forwards through that list and recall each state as we're doing so. Now, for navigation, one thing we need to keep track of is our current progress. That way we can move back and forward and stay within the realm of the list and maintain our positioning. So public int, we'll call it progress equals 0. And how about we have a status text as well? Let's get something that'll show us what our current progress is on screen, as well as show us when we're actually on a history state versus when we're not. So serialize field private, we'll do this on a text mesh pro UGUI item called status text. Okay, and we want the history manager. So history manager, since that has our list of history, we'll just call it manager and point that to the history manager.instance. And for shorthand, let's also get the history list. So we'll get a list of history state called the history, and we'll point that to the manager.history. All right, so in addition to that, let's also make a way to know whether we are viewing history or not. We're not going to use the progress integer for a reason we'll discuss in a minute, but we will use a boolean. So bool is viewing history equals false. This will be important for some other classes to know when they are allowed to move forward, such as our dialog system. If we click next, but we're viewing history, we should not move on to the next line of the file, but we should move on to the next history state. That way we don't start mixing and matching things and mess up, because a history state might not have the expected place for things to be, such as characters. They might be in a different position or might have different background or music that another line in the file would be expecting if we had not gone back in history. So we need to know what we're doing and if we're viewing history or not. So let's say that we go back, because we're starting at the very front. Let's go ahead and see what we do when we go back. Well, first of all, we can only go back if our progress is not at 0. The reason being is as we add items to the list, we're starting at index 0, and for every item that is added to the list, that index is incrementing. So the beginning of the history, or the latest history entry, is actually going to be the highest index, and the farthest back point is going to be at index 0. So if progress equals 0, we shouldn't do anything. And is viewing history. So if that's true, we're just going to return and we're going to do nothing. If we're viewing history and we're trying to go back, but we're already at the farthest point we can go, then we return and we do nothing. Now, little side note, and this is very important. As of this point, when we try to go back in history, the state that we're currently at, what's currently on the screen, has not been recorded yet. So if we go back in history and then try to go all the way forward again, we're not going to get back to the point where we were because that hasn't been logged yet. It's only logged once the screen is cleared. So in order for us to go back to where we were, we need to cache a temporary history state. So we'll do that right up above. We'll make a little cache for a history state called cached state, and it'll be null by default. And then we'll just see, since our progress will never be at a point that represents the cached state, we'll use another boolean to let us know if we are looking at the cached state or if we're somewhere in the history list. So we'll do a private bool is on cached state equal false right off the bat. All right, so if we have a valid point to go back in history, then let's figure out where we need to go to. So let's say progress equals, and let's see, if we're viewing history. If we're already viewing history, then we need to decrease the amount, and we need to go back towards the beginning. So if we're viewing history, we're going to do progress minus 1. If not, then we need to make sure that when we start viewing history, we start at the very latest point, which would be history.count minus 1. Now, if we have just started moving or just started viewing history, then we need to do a couple things. First off, we need to make sure that our move forward function is tied to the next event in the player input, so if ever we hit any of those keys that cause us to go forward in the dialog file, they'll cause us to go forward in history too. So we need to subscribe to that. And we're also going to say that we need to generate a new cached state, and we also need to say that we are now viewing history. So if not is viewing history, then is viewing history equals true because we are now viewing it. Is on cached state equals false, and let's generate that cached state. So cached state equals history state dot capture. And now let's go ahead and subscribe our go forward to the on user prompt next within the dialog system. So dialog system dot instance dot on user prompt next, we need the event, not the function, on user prompt next plus equals go forward. So now anytime we hit enter or space or anything while we're viewing history, that will not take us through the dialog file, but it'll take us moving through the history state. And we'll need to do a little something extra with that in a minute. But if you'll also notice, when we were going through the history state, that little bouncing prompt didn't go away. So we can fix that by saying dialog system dot instance dot prompt dot hide. Because we don't want that visible. Okay. Another thing, what if our auto reader is running? You know, our auto reader will be just automatically moving us through the file, and we don't necessarily want that to happen while we're viewing the history. If we're using the auto reader and we decide to go back in history, we need to stop it. So let's go ahead and define a way where we can tell the dialog system that we've started viewing history, and then it can go through and tell whatever things it needs to stop. So I'm actually gonna move that into the dialog system for the prompt. And let's open up the dialog system real quick. The dialog system is going to have a new function called public void on start viewing history. And at this point, we will say prompt.hide because we don't want it visible. And we'll also check if autoreader.isOn, then autoreader.disable. We don't want that to be going. So we'll hide our prompt and we'll disable the autoreader. And so for history navigation, we'll go ahead and say that dialog system dot instance dot on start viewing history. Everything that needs to execute there is going to execute. Now we should have our progress set, and we can go ahead and load that history state. So history state equals history at whatever our progress is. We're going to grab that point in time, and we're going to say, we could just call it straight from here. We don't even need to use the manager right now. We could say state.load. And then we need to update the status text to show us where we are. So let's make a function for that. Private void update status text. And we'll just call it here, update status text. What this is going to do is it's going to take our status text .text and set it equal to this string. We want to get our history count, we want to get our progress and compare that to the actual history count. So we could say progress, and then it could be like 3 of 5 maybe. So our second value will be the history.count. Okay, so if we're going to do that, then we would actually need to increment progress by 1. So the last index, or 0, would really be 1. So we could have 1 of 6. And that would be the first entry in the history state. So if we were at the very beginning of the history, this would read 1 of 6, or something like that. But I would like the farthest point to be referenced by 1, and or actually the most recently added state to be referenced as the number 1 of whatever the count is. And the first one that was generated at index 0 should be equal to the number of the history. So it should look like the farthest point. For that to happen, we just want to subtract our progress from our history count, and we'll get the right appearance there. So history.count minus progress. Now, how about if we're trying to move forward? So if we're trying to go forward in history, let's check. If not is viewing history, then we shouldn't be going forward at all. So we're going to return. However, if we are, then we need to see whether we are going back to the cached state, which was the farthest point where we originally started before we went back through history, or if we're going through some random point inside of the list. So let's first get a state to cache that into. State equals null. And let's check. If progress is less than history.count minus 1, then we know that we have still further to go. We're somewhere deep in the history and we need to move back towards the front. So we'll go ahead and increment our progress, and then we'll say state equals history at that progress. Otherwise, we have now exited history and we are looking back at the cached state. So we should say is on cached state equals true, and we should say state equals cached state. And then it's just a matter of loading whichever state it is. So state.load. And if we're on a cache state, then we know that we have exited and we've come back to the most current point in the file, so we can go on and continue with reading the dialog file. So let's check. If is on cached state, then is viewing history equals false. And then we'll also say we need to unsubscribe this go forward from the next event inside of the player input. So dialog system.instance.on user prompt next minus equals go forward. So we're relinquishing control right back to it. And our status text should equal nothing. And for our dialog system, we'll go ahead and make another function here, public void on stop viewing history. And what this will do is it will say prompt.show. So we'll show our prompt again, and this will be a visual indicator that we're back where we should be. So status text show and dialog system dot instance dot on stop viewing history. Now, if we have not returned to the cache state, then this is just a regular state, and we need to update our progress and the visualization of that on the screen. So update status text. This should allow us to go backwards and forwards through our history. So only one way to find out, and that is to test it. As we come back into Unity, first thing we want to do is we want to assign this status text. So I'm going to come down and I'm going to just go into the dialog, and we've got this auto read status. Since we're disabling the auto reader anytime we run this, this will be a good place to put our history status. So I'm going to duplicate that and put this as history status. And I'll just default that to be nothing. Okay, let's try this. And let's just make sure we assign history status to that status text field. And let's launch Unity and try it. So I got a couple lines here. Let's go ahead and skip through them. We get to a speaker, and we'll go ahead and get that line as well. Okay, so I hit back. And now we get 1 of 5. So we are on history state 1 of 5, 5 being the farthest back. We could see we've gone back, but our name is missing. So we'll have to address that in a second. But we are getting the dialogue. And we can go all the way back to the beginning. Looks like it's working. And we should have a cached state here in a second. So if I press right one more time, we're at 1 of 5. We should exit out of viewing history, so this should become false. And we should get back the other line. So let's look back. The last one we have is in our history is it's the village, hurry, we're almost there, which is what we're on. So I hit the right arrow, and there we go. Excitement filled their breath and fueled their steps. We are no longer viewing history. We've got our prompt back because we have gone back to the cached state. Okay, looks good. But we do need to fix the issue with our names. Let's go back and let me hit the mouse button. Okay, so also we need to take care of this. We have subscribed our move forward to the on next event, but we didn't tell the on next event to stop moving the dialog system forward when we click if we're viewing history. So let's take care of the name not showing up, and let's take care of that. So the first issue with our speaker names not showing up comes in our dialog data, where we apply the data back to the screen. Sure, we're setting the name text to equal the current speaker, but we're not re-enabling it. So let's do that real quick. If name text.text is not equal to a string.empty, then we want to show our name container again. So we'll say ds.dialog container, ds being our dialog system, .name container .show. Otherwise, ds.dialog container .name container .hide. And now, if I were to go back, we can see that the names come back the way they are supposed to be. But you notice that, well, one thing, and I didn't fix this before, is when we enter skip and then exit skip again, we don't remove the title text. So let's go ahead and take care of that as well while we're at it. For that, we need to come into our auto reader script, and let's go down into the toggles. So inside of our toggles, let's say, well, as I'm looking at this, we're setting the status text to auto and to skip regardless of if it's enabled or not. So let's just say if is on, then set the status text. If is on, meaning it's enabled, then we set the status text to auto or to skip. Also, if we're viewing history, then we shouldn't be able to turn auto and skip on either. So let's make a way to limit if we can toggle or not. So I'll make a boolean up here. I'll make a boolean we'll make this hide in or actually, this isn't in the inspect. Is it? Yeah, it is. Hide in inspector. public bool allow toggle. And by default, this will be true. So we'll come down and under toggle auto, if not allow toggle, return. And we'll do the same thing for skip. If we don't allow the toggle, then we return and we do nothing. So in dialog system, when we start viewing history, then we'll go ahead and say auto reader, the variable auto reader dot allow toggle equals false. We have started viewing history, so we don't want to be able to turn that on. But when we stop viewing history, we want to set that to true. We're controlling all these things through the dialog system. That way, we don't wind up with spaghetti code. So we don't want to reference the history manager from every which class. We just want to limit that as much as we can. So we do this straight from the dialog system, and that should be good to go. So let's just try that. I can hit auto, turn it off, text goes away, skip, turn skip off, text goes away. Looks like we're good. And now let me go back in history and hit auto. Nothing happens. Skip, nothing happens. But if I exit, now I can go back into auto mode and I can go back into skip. All right, looks good. But let's go back in history. And now let me click the screen. I'm at the very beginning. So what should happen is I should go to this line. I should go to 9 of 10. But if I click, then it tries to continue off where it was in the dialog file. This is what we need to stop. We need to get it back to this point where it only navigates through the viewing of the history. In order for us to do that, we now need to go into the conversation manager. We are going through a lot of classes in this episode, and that's because the history manager just needs to integrate with all of these different parts. So what we want to look for is on user prompt next. This is why we're still able to go through, because even though we're viewing the history state, on user prompt next is subscribed to the dialog system on user prompt next, and so is go forward in the history state. So we need to silence this in order for us not to encounter this issue. We don't want to remove it, but we just want to not allow it if we are viewing history. So I'm going to make another public boolean. That way I'm not directly tying this into the history system. This will be a public bool allow user prompts, which will be true by default. And we'll just say if allow user prompts, then user prompt equals true. And in our dialog system, when we start viewing history, we're going to say our conversation manager dot allow user prompts equals false. And when we end it, then our conversation manager dot allow user prompts equals true. Okay, so now I have gone through and I've gone to a much farther point in the story. As you can see, we have 34 entries or 35 entries into the history state. So we continue on forward, we're getting all these different parts, but there's also going to be another character come in. So we now see that everyone has been darkened on screen, so that should be recorded in a history state as well. So let's look at history state 41, characters. We've got the innkeeper there, Stella, and is highlighted as false. But if we look back at a different one, Stella is highlighted as true, so yep, it's recording all that right. Then new character comes through. So now we should have 4 characters on screen. 4, yep, we got Stella, Raylene, Innkeeper, Monk. And let's just go forward a little further until the monk leaves. Monk is now gone. Okay, so he should no longer be in element 53, which he's not. We have Stella, Raylene, and Innkeeper. Okay, so let's go a little further. And now he's gone, and now we switch to a new scene. Alright, so there we are. Now I'm going to go ahead and go back in history, and we can see everyone is showing up. I don't know if the face left is working. I don't know if that is. Well, Raylene's facing right. Looks like he was facing a different direction. I'm not sure if he was or not. But we see they are darkened. Looks good. So everyone appears to have the right stuff. Okay. It actually looks like everything is working pretty well. Yeah, looks like everything's working pretty good. Okay, I think that's good. Now, before we end this off, though, the last thing that we might want to do is just add a limit to our history. So that way we're not caching an infinite number of states. We'll go ahead and set just a limit and start removing older states once we reach that limit. So let's go ahead and define that with a public constant integer history cache limit. And I'm going to set mine to, let's say something like 100. Maybe we'll change that later, maybe not. So let's go ahead and see. Before we add this to the state, let's go, actually we can go ahead and add it to the state, and we'll just remove the first one. So if history.size, or count, is greater than the history cache limit, then history.remove at, and we're going to remove the very first one in the list. And just for testing, I'm going to set this down to 15, just so we can see it work. So here we go. We got our history, and as we go forward, we're adding more and more items. And we get up to 15 in a second. There we are, 15. And now we are not going past 15. So if we look at the last one, it's the village. Hurry, we're almost there. So now let's cache it. Boom. The last one is now excitement filled their breath. So let's take a look at this. We within moments should go up here, and as we click, sure did. Okay, awesome. So our cache is being limited to whatever size this is. And with that, we're going to go ahead and end this episode off. We've gone ahead and taken care of a lot of stuff, and the only thing left for us to do history-wise is to add a history log. That way we can go through and just see all of the text for everything that's happened so far. So we'll do that in the next part. I'll see you guys later.